Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on mini grid called Grid Interconnection of Micro/Mini Hydro Mini Grid. What happens when the national grid arrives? Please note that this is a re-recording of the original webinar, as due to some technical error we could not record our original webinar. This webinar is the second webinar in a series of 3 webinars. We had our first webinar on why mini-grid technologies need to be differentiated. You can watch the recording on Energypedia, and we also have our third webinar on productive end use coming up in early July. About us, this webinar is a collaboration between 3 organizations: Energypedia, a knowledge platform for renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy access topics; Hydro Empowerment Network, a platform for micro/mini hydro practitioners in South and Southeast Asia. The core support for ASP.NET comes from Vision Initiative at the Wuppertal Institute. And finally, SCART Foundation, established by SCART Consulting in 2002 to foster the exchange of knowledge and experience in development cooperation. Although this webinar is a collaboration between 3 partners, we are also looking forward to expand the webinar series. And therefore, if you are interested in collaborating with us, you can either donate to the webinar series, or you can also collaborate with us on content and help us shape the next or the upcoming webinars. So please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to have you as our partner for the upcoming webinar. Regarding the webinar materials, as this is a re-recording, you can find the recording of the first presentation and second presentation on Energypedia. All the questions and answers that were asked during the webinar has been documented in a separate PDF file and will also be uploaded on Energypedia. And now I would like to pass on to my colleague Heidi, who will talk about will quickly summarize the presentations and also talk about the different knowledge products that are interesting for grid interconnection. Now up to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Ranisha, for this introduction. My name is Heidi Feibel, working for SCART Foundation, as Ranisha already mentioned. I'm going to give you a short overview on the topic, and as you already heard, the detailed contents are available in separate recordings on the case studies of Sri Lanka and Indonesia. So what are these presentations about? We mainly look at mini micro hydro systems, which are supplying communities through a mini grid and which are later on then connected to the national grid. So we don't look at hydropower systems which have from the very beginning be connected to the grid, and we also don't look at so-called interconnection of several mini grids, so-called clusters. This is a separate topic, and we thought it's better to separate it from the current one. And we also don't look at different licensing models for distribution grids, like small power distributors, franchisees, and similars. So we want to present you in these different recordings the implications of grid interconnection, including the required investment. We look at who benefits and how the different stakeholders benefit. And we also look at this topic of islanding, which means once a mini grid is connected to the national grid, should it then still be possible to operate in a separate mode? This is very relevant for developing countries where the national grid is less reliable, meaning if the national grid goes down, then there should be an option that the customers of the originally mini hydropower system are still able to supply themselves by the grid that they still have. So they can operate in parallel to the national grid. As you heard at the beginning, there are 2 case studies available in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And I would like to give you the general frame of these 2 countries. So we selected first Indonesia because in Indonesia there are already 800 mini micro hydropower systems countrywide implemented. 400 of them have been grid connected from the very start. and 400 were built as community-owned mini-grids. And from these 400 that were implemented as community-owned mini-grids, about roughly half of them already suffer, or I mean maybe also benefited from the arrival of the national grid. That means in these 200 cases, the national grid arrived, and due to that fact, about 150 of the mini and micro hydropower systems have already been abandoned, meaning that the originally constructed systems were not used anymore, or they are no more used at the moment. 40 of these systems where the national grid arrived still continue operation. That means they decided, although the national grid is there, we still rely on our mini micro hydropower system and we do not connect to the national grid. And very few of them, of these 200, namely 9 hydropower systems, succeeded to get later on connected to the national grid. That means they can sell their surplus electricity to the national grid. From these figures that I mentioned here, you see that it's a really relevant case to look at these mini-grids, what happens when the national grid arrives. And there is a real need for advocacy to avoid the waste of resources and of earlier investments. So partly these are subsidized projects, partly NGOs invested in these systems. So it would be really a pity just to keep them up, like this was already the case for 150 abandoned systems. In addition, it should be mentioned at this point that in Indonesia, a strong mini and micro hydropower industry developed over the last years. So for the case in Sri Lanka, it's a bit different. There were 2 big programs implemented in the past. One is the ESD and the other is the RERAD, which is going to be explained in detail in the PowerPoint presentation. And these 2 programs led to about 170 micro mini hydropower systems. And in Sri Lanka, the government tried to achieve a certain quality standard. That's why they have so-called registered consultants and qualified engineers, which should finally guarantee a certain technical standard of the implemented systems, these 170 hydropower systems that have been implemented. In Sri Lanka, these systems were based on so-called electricity consumer societies, which were originally the owners and operators of the system. And since the national grid extended more and more and most people got connected to the national grid, there was also the question, what is going to happen? So in many cases, private investors might be interested to take over, but also maybe the electricity consumer societies. So if such consumer societies are interested to connect their system to the grid, they need to transform into a limited liability company. And if an investor wants to interfere, then he has to leave at least 5% of the ownership to the electricity consumer society. This is because these projects had been government subsidized. And the idea is that the community at the very end should always benefit at least to 5% of the ownership. So there should never be an investor who takes over 100% of these subsidized schemes. So far in Sri Lanka, only 3 projects have been connected. 2 further are under implementation, 10 are in the stage of application, and there's potential for 30 more. So this is just to give you the general setting, the general frame, how it looks like in the 2 different countries. And for more details, please refer to the separate recordings on the 2 case studies. On the next slide, I would like to compare 4 different countries in the region. Just not only look at Indonesia and Sri Lanka, which are presented in detail in these separate recordings, but also to look at India and Nepal as countries in the region. How do they manage the situation of possible grid connection of originally separate island mini-grids? So the table gives you the number of mini micro hydropower systems which have been connected ex post, the kilowatt range, the year of interconnection, and what is currently the guaranteed feed-in tariff or the negotiated PPA rate. So you see in Indonesia already quite a number of systems, namely 9, have been implemented. They're in the range between roughly 10 and 600 kilowatt. And the first one has already been connected in 2003, which is quite early compared to the other countries. The independent power producers who only sell their electricity to the grid, they get around 60 to 80% of the avoided cost of the national utility. That depends, which one they get depends on the voltage level. And if a community only sells excess power, not all power, but just the excess power which they don't need on their own, then they get even 90% of the avoided cost. Currently, this leads to a feed-in tariff of between 4 and 9 US cents per kilowatt hour. For Sri Lanka, I mentioned before, 3 systems have already been implemented. They are in the range of 10 to roughly 50 kilowatt. The first one was connected in 2012, which means quite late compared to Indonesia. And their current feed-in tariff is very comfortable in the range of 10 to 11.8 US cents per kilowatt hour. In India, 12 systems are in progress. They are in the range between 100 and 200 kilowatt, and they're expected to be implemented or to be really connected to the grid this year. As preliminary information, we want to inform you that the feed-in tariff is between about 4 and 5 US cents per kilowatt hour, and as far as we know, it has to be negotiated. For Nepal, they're already not as far as Sri Lanka and Indonesia. They connected the first, or they are going to connect the first 2 systems of 23 and 40 kilowatt this year in August 2017. They have the same feed-in tariff for systems in the range between 1 kilowatt and even 25 megawatts. So they all get the same tariff, which is in the range of 4.8 US cents for wet season and 8.4 US cents per kilowatt hour for the dry season. Because in wet season, Nepal anyway has sufficient power, so there is no need to provide additional incentive, whereas in the dry season you get a relatively high feed-in tariff. So this is to give you an overview on the 4 countries. As a general conclusion from the 2 detailed presentations on Sri Lanka and Indonesia, I would like to stress that we see in many Asian countries that there are numerous micro mini hydropower mini grids already existing, like for example in Indonesia, and there are more to come. And on the other hand, the national grid is going to be extended more and more. So meaning that this grid interconnection is a really relevant topic for many countries in the region. So sooner or later, each country has to make its own decision on how they are going to handle this case. Do they just give up the investment, or do they try to make the best out of it? So we recommend from the experience that we have so far that grid interconnection should be considered from the very beginning even. So to make very clear who is the owner of the system, meaning who is going to benefit later on once the system is connected to the grid and once you can generate additional revenues. But also to look at the technical standard, that it's not too expensive to make a later grid connection, because you already have a technical standard which might be accepted by the national utility. I would like to mention that the interconnection cost depends on the kilowatt range, meaning that small systems are cheaper to be connected than bigger systems. But the systems we are talking about are roughly in the range for interconnection between, let's say, 5,000 and 25,000 US dollar as a total investment. But you can find more detailed information for Indonesia and Sri Lanka in the separate presentations. So it's important to look who is going to benefit. So for the consumers, it's important that they have a reliable supply, meaning if the national grid is switched off or if there's any breakdown, they maybe still can supply themselves with a hydropower scheme. But on the other hand, they can improve their supply by getting electricity once from the national grid once the hydropower system is not operating. So reliable supply is the most important benefit for the consumers. To receive additional revenues is an additional benefit for the community as a whole if they organize themselves and feed in electricity to the national grid. For the utility, there's also an added value because they have additional generation potential, and they somehow have limited their risk because they have more distributed generation in several points in the national grid. So if one plant is down, maybe the other is still operating, so they can somehow reduce their overall risk. We would like with these presentations to stress that there is additional advocacy required. And that's also the reason why Hydro Empowerment Network, together with Energipedia and SCART Foundation, we try to also promote knowledge products, meaning we try to collect the knowledge which is available, the experience from different countries, and to make it available to others. So on the next slide, you see a number of knowledge products that have already been developed. The first one is a paper on frequently asked questions, which is mainly addressing the technical questions which utilities might have, because they play a very important role in that whole setting. They are often the ones who enable or who avoid or who stop hydropower systems from feeding electricity into the grid. So they have to be convinced from the very beginning. So this paper addresses their more technical questions. There is a second one from the SMAP Global Facility on Mini-Grids. It's called Mini-Grids and the Arrival of the Main Grid, Lessons from Cambodia, Sri Lanka and Indonesia. In the second column of this table, you see where you can access this kind of information. The third one is a paper from the Alternative Energy Promotion Center in Nepal, AEPC. They have a paper which is called Development of Grid Interconnection Policy for Micro Mini Hydro Plants in Nepal. Then there are two videos, the first one from the Asian Awards and the NGO IBECA in Indonesia on the case study of Cinta Mekar. There's a second video on smart grids for rural electrification. And last but not least, I'd like to mention that there is a lot of other knowledge products available on the Energipedia webpage, where you can click on the Micro Mini Hydropower Library, and then you go to the search field and you follow this instruction, and then you get a list of different knowledge products. So this is somehow to give you a link to further relevant knowledge products. And as I mentioned, please have a look at the two different recordings on the cases of Indonesia and Sri Lanka. So at this point, I would like to hand over again to my colleague Ranisha. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Now I would like to close the webinar by saying a thank you to all our people, our friends, and supporters who have helped to compile the webinar and make it come online. And we'd also like to shout out to all our listeners. If you're interested in collaborating with us on organizing further webinars on new topics, you can contact us. That means either me or Heidi, or you can also send us an email at info@energipedia.info, and we'd be more than happy to collaborate with you. Thank you.